the studio in the coming days for one more stab at greatness, George worried, justifiably, whether or not they could recapture the magic of days gone by. Was it even possible, at this late date, to take the Beatles' sad song and make it better? 1. You say it's your birthday. On January 3rd, 1966, George Martin celebrated his 40th birthday with his fiancée Judy Lockhart Smith by his side. With marriage in the offing, George's future shone brightly. On the professional front, he had just completed production work on Rubber Soul, the Beatles' latest studio album and their sixth straight UK chart topper. The long player had proven to be pioneering in every sense of the word. As George later observed, I think Rubber Soul was the first of the albums that presented a new Beatles to the world. Up to this point, we had been making albums that were rather like a collection of their singles, and now we really were beginning to think about albums as a bit of art in their own right. We were thinking about the album as an entity of its own, and Rubber Soul was the first one to emerge in this way. Like Paul McCartney, George perceived the album as a result of a growing collaboration between himself and the Beatles, as opposed to the more authoritative position that he had assumed with earlier projects. Previously, George had a lot of control. We used to record the stuff and leave him to mix it, pick a single, everything, Paul later remarked. After a while, though, we got so into recording we'd stay behind while he mixed it, watching what he was doing. But for his part, John Lennon had already begun to see the bandmates' working relationship with George evolving even further still. We were getting better technically and musically, that's all. We finally took over the studio, John observed. With Rubber Soul, we were more precise about making the album, that's all. We took over the cover and everything. Forced to produce the long player between the Beatles' stints on the road, George had delivered Rubber Soul in breakneck fashion. Recorded between October 12th and November 15th, 1965, the album was mastered for release and in the shops by December 3rd, along with the band's latest single, Day Tripper, backed with We Can Work It Out. In the space of slightly more than 50 days, George and the Beatles had brought 16 new tracks to fruition and into the hands of Beatles fans across the globe. Such was the pace in those heady days of mid-period Beatlemania. As it happened, there was no rest for the bandmates, who performed 18 concerts that same month on their UK winter tour. Not surprisingly, by the time the new year rolled around, the Beatles were drained. But the same could hardly be said for their producer, who had just concluded another banner year in which his acts had reigned atop the charts, and who also ended his long-standing employment with the EMI Group to establish a consortium of producers known as Associated Independent Recording, or AIR for short. But rather than giving in to exhaustion, George had been buoyed by the exhilarating experience of going into business for himself. As George later observed, my workload was enormous, so that I was spending more time in the studio than I was anywhere else, and I found myself completely and utterly wrapped up in my work. By Thursday, January 6, 1966, George was back in the studio with the Beatles, only this time George and the bandmates weren't in the studio to tackle new material for their waiting world of hungry consumers. And the studio, for that matter, wasn't the friendly environs of good old No. 2 at Abbey Road that they knew so well. Instead, George and the Beatles had gathered a few miles further south at Cinetella Sound Studios, CTS. Located in Kensington Gardens Square in London's Tony Bayswater district, CTS opened for business in 1956, having been constructed in a converted banquet hall that formerly served Whiteley's Gentlemen's Dining Club. With its ornate, crown-molded ceilings reaching a height of 26 feet, the banquet hall was rather large, measuring 40 feet across and 85 feet deep. During its heyday, the hall had also functioned as a runway for parading the latest European fashions. But by the time that George and the Beatles alighted there in January 1966, the cavernous space enjoyed renown as the go-to place for cinema and television soundtrack recording. George himself had recorded there many times as the band leader behind the George Martin Orchestra. In the mid-1960s.
To keep listening to this audiobook for free, click the link in the description. It will take you to a free Audible trial where you can listen to this and many other books for free for 30 days.